So we'll probably, carry on the debate that Lord Darling started here for another 20 minutes or so. And this time we have 3 other people on the panel. Clearly, both from a risk, uncertainty, disruption, cost, how to manage political agendas in the time of technology. All these are really big concerns as we are going through a lot of the discussions with our customers as well. By the way, my name is Gaurav and I serve as the Chief Operating Officer at MetricStream. I know most of you, but I thought I'll do a quick intro there. We have 3 people here. One, clearly, with Lord Darling, we have 3 others. We have Steve Fowler, who is the managing director of Emirates Consulting. Steve, yeah, please come on stage. And Steve, his firm provides advisory and training to help businesses, charities, and individuals achieve their potential in terms of strategy, organizational culture, risk management, governance, change management as well. He has previously served for many years as the Chief Executive Officer of the Institute of Risk Management, the world's leading professional body for risk, as many of you guys are probably aware, and also as a commercial IT director and business transformation head for RSA Insurance's commercial division. A graduate from Oxford, he started as an as a risk engineer and occupational health and safety advisor in the insurance industry, and since then, has taken on business functions, across multiple companies as well, and is a prolific writer on risk themes as well. Thank you for joining us, Steve. We have a Labour Party MP, William Bain, welcome, a former Labour Party MP. And he also currently serves as a policy advisor for international trade and Brexit for the British Retail Consortium. William, he started out in different functions, and he was elected as a Labour Party MP for his home constituency in Glasgow Northeast in 2009 and served for 6 years. He also served as a PPS to Minister of State for Transport, Sadiq Khan, in 2010, and held a variety of front bencher posts under Harriet Harman as an acting Labour leader and Ed Miliband as a leader, including transport, food and farming, and also Scotland. He was also a member of the Business Innovation and Skills Select Committee, and with policy interests in a number of areas. He worked in consultancy after the 2015 UK general election until joining the British Retail Consortium this year, which obviously has a lot of both financial distribution impact as we think about Brexit. Last but not the least, we have our very own French Caldwell. French, welcome to the stage. French serves as the chief evangelist at MetricStream and is responsible for a lot of the thinking and listening to customers and helping with our product strategy. French is a former fellow and vice president at Gartner Research, where he actually headed the GRC and was responsible for creating the governance, risk, and compliance practice at Gartner for many years. Prior to that, he worked at the White House and the US Naval War College to develop what was called the Digital Pearl Harbor game. It was the first ever strategic assessment of cyber war strategies. And in 2012, the game actually took on a very real form with the strategic attacks on the oil and gas infrastructure in Saudi and Qatar. French is also a retired naval officer and a very proud nuclear submariner. He asked me, we were debating whether to call it submariner or submariner, depending on where you are. And French, as an academic as well, he's been involved very closely with the Brookings Institution and also with the George Washington University. So welcome, French. And I will actually leave it to you, French, to actually moderate the panel for the next 20 minutes. And I'm sure there are a lot of questions and issues that have come up. Thank you.
Thank you, Gaurav. And I'm standing in for Gaurav because of his very significant injury there in cricket the other day. So he's an avid cricket player. But he will be moderating the next discussion. So we're going to follow a theater in the round format here. We have a couple of people with microphones. You identify yourselves. Here, over here, somebody else. We have somebody else with a microphone right over there. So anytime that you have an issue you would like to bring up, or you want to share what you think should be done on a particular issue that we're discussing, please don't wait until the end. We will invite you to join us in this discussion, and I'll try to reach out to everyone in the room regularly during the next 30 minutes. Now, on the panel, I'm going to ask each of our panelists, except for you, Lord Darling, we know where you stand, sir. We're going to ask each of our panelists to share right at the beginning here a couple of key issues associated with Brexit or some of the other drivers that may be behind Brexit, and put those key issues out in front. What do they consider the key issues that we in the room should be taking action on? And we'll very briefly state those. Then I want to get some key issues from you, and then we'll start our discussion. So, William, why don't we start with you as far as some key issues associated with Brexit. What do you think our corporate leaders here should be focused on?
Well, thank you, French. I work with some of Britain's biggest companies to guide them through the process of Brexit, to advise on what's happening at UK and EU levels, and also to sort of speak with them about the preparations that they're making for what's going to be a new corporate and trading environment. And I'm struck, if I can sort of refer to a sort of US politician, with how much that sort of Brexit reminds me of what Donald Rumsfeld might have called an unknown unknown. Because business doesn't know as yet what it's transitioning to, because we can't tell what the shape of the final deal is going to be. And it doesn't really know the process by which we're going to get there. And that's very different from what happened when the UK joined the EEC after 7 years of preparation in 1973. So I think the key issues for companies at the moment is to prepare for a best case scenario where goods and particularly on services have good levels of access to the EU internal market post-2019 and post-transition, and also to prepare for the worst case scenario, which is that we exit without a deal. So I think the key issue for business at the moment is showing leadership in managing this uncertainty.
Thanks, William. Steve?
Showing leadership in managing uncertainty, you've taken the words straight out of my mouth. I was going to start with risk management. This is a risk management conference, isn't it? And you look at the risk management process that we use every day in terms of managing risk within our organisations, and that says we should start with what we know and what we don't know. We should also start with a proper analysis of what's happening out there in the wider world. So, what do we know? We know that 1/3 of the country voted for Brexit, 1/3 voted against Brexit, the other 1/3 either didn't vote or were disenfranchised from voting because they were under the voting age at the time. We also know, though, that people voted for different reasons. So some people voted for taking back control, whatever that might mean. Other people voted for a longing to go back to the 1970s, the 3-day week, and flared trousers. There are huge geographic and generational differences between the way that people voted. And when we look at an issue as complex as Brexit, we would be wise to keep those differences in mind. If you travel up the west side of this country, you'll travel through areas of relatively great prosperity, from London to the West Midlands to the northwest. I have family in Yorkshire and Northumberland. I can tell you, if you travel up the A1, you travel through areas of high unemployment and areas that the people who live there, in many cases, feel the world has passed them by. So where are we now? The pound is cheaper. Some would say that that was a correction that was way overdue. However, an ever cheaper pound won't be good for any of us. And labour shortages, particularly in areas like engineering and medicine, are beginning to become apparent. But one could argue that those labour shortages were always there. You know, it's a factor of the makeup of the British workforce. They've just been camouflaged by the fact that we've been able to import labour from Europe and around the world. And there's a huge amount of uncertainty. So that's what we know. When it comes to world challenges, well, I have to start with the fourth industrial revolution. We talked about AI and robotics earlier on today. PwC estimate that 1/3 of UK jobs will be automated in the next 15 years. My own personal view is that's probably a bit on the light side. I reckon it could be higher than that. However, in Westminster, many politicians are still talking about rebalancing the economy from services to manufacturing, just as the AI revolution is tipping the world economy in the opposite direction. So that leaves me fearful that maybe our leaders of all political complexions aren't tuned in to what's happening in the world. The other big world challenge that we face are large-scale population shifts, whether that's caused by war, by terrorism, or by relative income disparity around the world. And when I last looked at the map of Europe, Britain was still part of Europe. And I can bet you one thing, at the end of this conference, at the end of the year, Britain will still be part of Europe, and it will still be part of Europe in 10 years. You know, geographically, that's where we are. And finally, in terms of world challenges, Lord Darling talked about it being better to try and do things together. We face issues such as cybercrime on a global scale and climate change on a global scale. We need to continue to look at those things globally. So, as risk professionals, what do? We start with world challenges and what we know. We also embrace scenario planning. You know, the US military invented scenario planning in the 1950s because war is an uncertain business. If ever there were a time to apply those sorts of techniques to business or to government, it's now. We don't know, none of us in this room know what's going to happen. In fact, it's probably impossible to work out what's going to happen. So the best we can do within our organisations, as risk professionals in guiding our organisations, is to provide guidance on planning for alternative outcomes and to have the strategies in place. And finally, before I shut up, let's keep in mind that the world is a complex system. You know, you only have to ask Theresa May that question. She called the election earlier this year in the absolute certain knowledge that she would come back with a higher majority. Why was that? Well, we all knew that Corbyn was a spent force and he was likely not to be leading the Labour Party by the end of this year. Well, how wrong can we be? The reality is that politics is a complex system. The external world is a complex system. We can try and make decisions to push our organisations in particular directions, but they won't always respond the way we want them to respond. So what would I do? Well, instead, you know, one can use triggers, one can use levers to nurture people in a particular direction within our organisation. But let's not think whether it's embracing a particular hard physical strategy or whether it's saying, right, okay, this is what I'm going to do as a business, to ignore the fact that there isn't a direct relation between taking a particular action and getting a particular outcome. That just doesn't exist.
Well, I think, when we look at what's been shared up here, I think, Lord Darling, you introduced also the sort of the potential scenarios, right, for Brexit. At least 2 out of 3, I think I heard. There was, the hard exit, the negotiated exit, and you kind of alluded to a third way with the agreement, some agreement to agree to not to extend, right? The
third one would be success.
Oh, okay.
But I'd rather park that since it doesn't seem to be at the starting line, that element of it yet. I think to leave the European Union, you have to agree an exit deal.
Right.
And what they're saying is until you've done that, we can't discuss future relationships. I would argue that actually you can and you need to. But what would happen is you either get a very hard exit where the lights simply switch off and you're out. Now, that is not in the interest of either side, actually. And so I think it is more likely you reach that situation where there is a complete breakdown, but at the 11th hour we agree to roll the thing over for a couple of years, because that's what Europe does. It's really difficult to plot this, because no one's ever done it before, and I say that no one was ever intended to leave. I know the person who drafted Article 50, and he drafted it confident that it would never ever be used, but it is being used. And as I say, because of the politics, because of the fact, as Steve said, after the general election, our government was very, very badly crippled in terms of authority. We're discussing things the wrong way around. The last thing you discuss is, well, how much are you paying? That largely depends, as I said earlier, on what you're going to get. So we shall wait and see. But here we are, in November of 2017, and there's no agreement on anything at all.
So, yeah, and this seems to be the big overarching issue, and William, you pointed that out too. What are we transitioning to? Where are we going? Are there other issues that people are dealing with, in particular, within your organizations? Does anyone care to share a key issue that you would like to see addressed in this discussion? Yes, sir, right over here. We have a microphone coming over to you. If you just introduce yourself, if you could, or if you prefer to remain anonymous, you may do so.
My name's Andrew Lee. I'm from a website called Ethical Leadership. It may sound a bit irrelevant in the context of Brexit, but the question I'd like to ask all of you is, do you see ethical leadership as an issue? Because we tend to think, in Britain anyway, that we have pretty good standards of regulation. But actually, as we've seen in Europe, suddenly all organizations that you thought were reliable are revealing all sorts of weaknesses. And as we go through this Brexit process, which is so focused on getting a good deal or getting a deal at all, you, sir, were talking about the importance of leadership. And for me, the question is, well, what kind of leadership? Are we going to get leaders that are concerned about culture, about the way organizations do what they're doing and how they do it, not just what they do? And that seems to be a critical factor which perhaps isn't being a major focus of the Brexit thing, understandably, but nevertheless is going to come through and will continue to come through, not only in Europe, but around the world, as we've seen in Saudi Arabia, where all of a sudden there's a huge concern now about corruption and issues to do with that, where before the issue was somehow irrelevant.
That's true. And same thing has happened in Brazil and also in China. Sometimes it's a power play and sometimes it's a legitimate action against corruption. But let's, any other issues out there? So we have ethical leadership. Anyone? How many people here in your organizations have a Brexit czar now? Someone who, that's the point person who's leading all the analysis for Brexit. Anybody? Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4. That was one of the big recommendations from the last summit, by the way, is that you have a Brexit czar. So we maybe don't have the leadership in our organizations as well to deal with Brexit.
Well, if I have to answer both these questions, I would have thought in any organization that Brexit is so central to most firms that it's a sort of chief executive job. You may well have somebody who will advise you on, the nuts and bolts of what it actually means to me. But especially when in most businesses have a plan, they would know where they want to be in a year's time, 5 years' time, and so on. It is difficult. On the gentleman's question about ethical leadership, yes, it's absolutely essential. You will never, ever get anyone to agree with you or to follow you if they look at you and say, I wouldn't touch that guy. If there's questions on, especially on corruption, which I do not think we have in the United Kingdom, frankly, but there are other issues, as I alluded to earlier, which need to be addressed. If people do not look at you, see on the television, read about you in a newspaper and think, okay, on balance, I'm willing to go with what this person says, then you are in a hiding to nothing. So, of course, ethics matter. They matter a great deal, even though there are parts of the world where it would appear that's not, the received wisdom on that may be open to challenge.
Well, one of the challenges here too is, I think it's certainly related to ethical leadership, but there's this whole concern that you mentioned about faith in institutions. Steve, you've raised that a little bit as well, but the faith in institutions seems to be not just confined to governmental institutions or to, for-profit institutions. We've seen it with all types of religious institutions, Hollywood. There's ride-sharing corporations. Ride-sharing corporations. There is this sense of institutions are almost under attack. Is there something that's changed where this is driving? It's a trend that's been going on for a while. It seems to have accelerated. Is this something that's we have to be working on?
Well, the simple answer, as you know, is yes.
Right.
It has changed. But there's two reasons. One is, the question, raised the question of ethical leadership. Well, there are two reasons why we should have ethical leadership. The first one is obvious. It's the right thing to do. And one only needs to look around the world of business to see that businesses that by and large operate in an ethical way tend to have greater longevity in the medium to long term, not the short to medium term. You can make a fast buck by being unethical, but eventually you get found out. But the second reason is there's nowhere to hide in today's world. What you do today, whether you are the Duchy of Lancaster investing the Queen's money through a trust fund somewhere in the Caribbean, that may be on TV last night. It's over all the news media this morning. There is nowhere to hide. So even if you don't believe in ethical leadership, it's still the right thing to do, because if you don't do it, you'll get found out. The word that we didn't focus on when it came to ethical leadership was, of course, the leadership word. And what I see around government at the moment in terms of negotiation Brexit is a complete lack of leadership. A lot of chatting, but not a lot in the way of leadership. Sometimes we have to make hard and difficult decisions in business and, I guess, in government. But, and those decisions have to be explained. It is perfectly feasible to lead an unpopular piece of work and to change stakeholders' minds. I see a lack of, if you like, willingness in government maybe at the moment to want to do that. We are, to use the old colloquial term, pussyfooting around the issues with Brexit because no one really wants to upset the electorate.
Well, let's take a look at another issue. Lord Darling mentioned the new privacy regime, the GDPR. Of all of our audience here, if you would indulge me just for a moment, how many of you could say that you have a point person for GDPR? Interesting. Almost everyone raised their hand here. And we had 5 people who have a point person for Brexit. Now, what does that tell us?
There is a huge difference between the two. If we take GDPR, you can actually read the regulations. So, like any good project, you've got a time frame, and you've got a defined, a scoped piece of work, and you know where you're going. With Brexit, I challenge anyone in the room to say what Brexit is. It's very difficult to plan around something that's not defined.
I agree. I mean, I think also within a business, I think GDPR is a more discrete area for compliance. What we're finding, the British Retail Consortium, is companies have got a variety of ways of dealing with it. Some are establishing specific groups within the board, bringing together several sets of professional teams within the companies, because Brexit involves things like customs, excise, VAT, but many other areas too. Whereas I think if you're complying with a discrete regulation, it's a bit easier to have that sort of chain of command from the board down to the particular team. I think also the question on ethics, this is something that's demanded more and more by the electorate and politics, but also by consumers of retail products and other products in other marketplaces. And I know at the moment that we're doing a lot of work around sustainable development goals, which some of Britain's biggest companies are buying into. One, because they intrinsically believe it's good in its own right to do this as ethical companies, but also that consumers over the last couple of decades in particular have demanded it. So I think there's been a change of culture both in society and within companies themselves about ensuring that there is more ethics. One thinks about the legislation that Alistair and I dealt with in our last parliaments, on modern slavery, and business were really strong partners in pushing that legislation through and implementing it. So there has been a cultural change.
Yes, I have a question over here.
David Creston, I'm an independent consultant. I wonder if any of the panelists could talk about Brexit and the rise of the virtual economy, virtual marketplace, including virtual currencies, and their views about what will change and what sort of risks will arise because of that.
Well, that's kind of interesting. I mean, it certainly points out that we're dealing with a number of issues that are running in parallel. I thought the point here earlier, leaders not necessarily knowing, all the other things that are going on is a bit of a problem. So in the banking system, there's been, I think, UK, the Bank of England has been at the forefront of dealing with virtual currencies, but haven't heard of that. Is there something you'd like to expand on as the impact of virtual currency on Brexit or vice versa?
No, it's really a question of whether this will promote a different set of circumstances and whether it will create a sort of parallel economy at a different speed in your viewpoint, but really just more of an open question, really.
Okay.
Should I just say something? I have some difficulty with the concept of a currency that doesn't belong to anybody. Having had more experience than most of you in this room of what happens when the financial system is about to collapse, one of the things that you learn very quickly is global banks and everything global becomes very national when things go wrong. And the thing about like the pound sterling, belongs to us. It's the Bank of England that ultimately stands behind it, and through that the UK government. I can see with a lot of blockchain and all these things that there might be a better system of transmitting money around the world. But that in itself brings a whole bunch of new risks. I think people were people. I think you were present actually when talking about the fact that now. One of the big problems is that people can hack into bank accounts, take large sums of money out of an account, break it into tiny bits, move it around the world instantaneously. And that is a huge, huge problem with these sort of cyber attacks. I think governments around the world will be nervous if they discover that their means of exchange isn't owned by anybody.
Let's take a look at maybe some of the underlying factors here too associated with Brexit. We're also seeing Brexit, I guess you pointed out, Lord Darling, that EU regulation seemed to be, and maybe EU overreach, Brussels overreach was a factor. But there were other factors as well, weren't there? I mean, people, the control, the border control, immigration, things of that nature seem to have been an underlying issue.
You were talking quite rightly that about who voted and which way they voted, and you're absolutely right that people voted different ways for a whole host of reasons. I think, though, in this country it became almost received wisdom that if there was something bad was happening, that's because of Europe. It's a bit like we blame health and safety for everything under the sun. If you actually ask people in business, what are your big complaints about over-regulation, they tend to be wholly owned by the UK, like VAT administration, for example, which is entirely our thing there. What I think that I was talking about, in relation to whether it's data protection or protecting consumers and advice and so on, that a lot of these directives start off with the best of intentions to try and stop some perceived wrong. But before you know where you are, you've got everything is being covered in a way that was, probably not anticipated. With regard, if you take data protection, you're now getting small charities saying, hold on, we'll never be able to raise any money again because we can't have a compliant regime that works. And that was never the intention of the stuff. My only point there is that, sadly, if we leave, we will have no vote whatsoever or restraining influence on any of these things. But guess what? We'll have to implement them. Because anyone in this country who trades into the rest of the European Union will have to be fully compliant, which is why we are if you go to Parliament today, it's starting at the House of Lords end, the legislation to implement that data protection is going through at the moment. And yes, you can see it, because it's all written out so you can see what's good or bad about it. But come what may with Brexit, it is going to be part of UK law because we've got to be compliant with it. Except we won't have any influence in the future as to what's in it in the first place.
We know what that's like in the U.S. In dealing with EU rules.
The MiFID II regulation is having to be implemented in the United States, even though it's a European legislation, which just demonstrates to me the size of the European market. So we'll have to be compliant with it as well. But all these things come back to the same. If you really want to take back control, you need to understand where control is in the first place. And letting someone else legislate for you, as a former politician and a Democrat, doesn't seem to me to have much going for it.
Well, there seems to be also this push on public policy issues being managed beyond sort of the traditional policymakers. When you look at social media, there's a number of studies that show roughly anywhere from 2 to 4% of the the Twitter users in any given public policy debate on social media actually are influencers. And you might say, well, that's a relatively small number, but actually it's a much larger number. 2 to 4% of several million people is a much larger number than what were traditionally involved in making public policy. Is this something that is contributing to the Scottish referendum, Brexit, the Catalonia movement, all of these things where public policy is being influenced by people who are not normally part of, who haven't traditionally been part of the system of government, academia, and the media?
One thing that I don't see discussed a great deal these days. I was born in the 1950s. And in the I know it shows, but in the 1950s, we had a map of the world with solid lines on the map, dividing countries from one another. Now, when one looks at decisions like Brexit, or potentially you look at the decision that hasn't been taken in Catalonia to either break away from Spain or not, those decisions tend to be taken on the basis of the equivalent of the 1950s map of the world. The reality is that in 2017, though, we have two maps of the world. We have that map of the world, and overlaying that map of the world, we have the modern map of the world, which shows the boundaries or lack of boundaries that exist through social media and social media firms, through the global financial system and the growth of cryptocurrencies and so on and so forth, and through the use of the same technology across the world. The trouble is, when we take a decision like Brexit, people take those decisions based on emotional grounds, based on, if you like, the 1950s map of the world. They don't take that decision necessarily, and I have to admit, I don't think I took my decision when I voted that day based on a view of, if you like, that overlying map of the world. So we've got two things going on, and what's gone wrong, if you like, with the decision on Brexit, other than the fact that my own belief is we voted the wrong way, that we didn't have enough information, there wasn't enough discussion around all this other stuff, around the fact that the world is fundamentally connected, and if we do not take into account those connections in making decisions like Brexit, we're going to make the wrong decision.
Well, you mentioned the best case and the worst case. How do you advise, and it's almost time here for us to kind of come up with the key takeaways here from this.
Right, okay.
So perhaps maybe you could share sort of a key takeaway on how you, on how you deal with the worst case scenario if you're a chief risk officer, corporate compliance officer? How do you help your company deal with the worst case scenario?
Well, I think around Brexit, the worst case scenario is that we will face huge delays at customs, and the getting of goods from A to B will become very much restricted. I think the worst case scenario is that companies will face import VAT costs to import goods from the continent, where at the moment there are none. So there are huge issues about cash flow, about staffing. It's a multifaceted problem around Brexit. So I think the advice that we give is to work through it stage by stage, to take on your supply chains, look at how secure they are. Do you need to think about getting goods from other countries in order to make up for restrictions there might be in getting them from the EU 27 and getting them in good time? Because I think one of the key things for retail is it's about getting goods on the shelves when consumers want them. And above all, what retail companies want to avoid is gaps on the shelves and gaps in supply. So that's what they're thinking very much about. It's about getting the right staff in place. At the moment in the retail industry, there are a lot of EU 27 nationals who work back of house, who are doing the logistics and the distribution functions. Very difficult to get UK citizens to want to do that kind of work because of the pay and the hours, the physical nature of it. So it's a multifaceted problem. I think the key thing is to get from CEO level down through the board, through the corporate affairs team and all the discrete professional teams, customs, VAT, excise, supply, to work together to have one sort of whole strategy around this. I think it was right to say that Brexit is probably the first action we've seen of a sort of reversal of globalization. When I went into politics, the sense was that globalization would continue. There was nothing to stop it. I remember the speech that Tony Blair gave at the Labour Party conference in about 2006, which was very much in that theme. We've now seen several events which have been a sort of bit of a pebble in the water. Brexit is one. Obviously the election of Donald Trump is another. And I think fundamentally, the reality about trade policy is, okay, China's coming up on the rails, but there are two axes around which countries revolve around in terms of their regulatory structures. There is the EU's axis and the US's axis. And what the government has to do over the next few months, if it's possible, is choose an option, whether they wish to have a sort of regulatory alignment to the EU in order to maximise the trade in goods and services that can be done with the continuing European Union, or whether they wish to de-align in order to try and pursue options in other markets. And I think certainly all of the economic data I've seen demonstrates that trying to pursue trade deals with India and with the US and with China, whilst they might be good in themselves, they don't make up for the trade that you lose if you have a bad deal with the European Union and we have strong regulatory barriers between the two markets. So I think fundamentally there needs to be clarity in business. Above all, there needs to be clarity from government in the coming months.
Thank you, William. Lord Darling, I'm going to give you the last word, sir.
A brief thing on social media. We have to be careful. I expect when the wheel was invented, there were lots of people who went around saying it's all terrible and, we'll live to regret this. It's there. It's a fact of life. You were reminding me earlier on that the earliest form of social media was in the Roman Forum, where people used to go around leaving notes on the wall saying Caesar is a bad man or whatever. So it's there. Where it becomes more sinister is where you get fake news, alternative facts, of which I think we're unfortunately becoming all too familiar, though I'm not quite clear how you can actually sort that out. But overall, coming back to the Brexit thing, I'm afraid it's a fact of life. We're in a very uncertain world. And if I were you, I would have to ask myself, okay, if it doesn't work out, where does that leave me? Do I need to do something? And you'd be well advised to do what you think you need to do to preserve your position. I hope it won't turn out like that, but as of the beginning of November of this year, it's looking as uncertain as ever.
Thank you very much, and thank you to our audience participants here as well.
Thank you very much.